A stone mountain built by hand still whispers its creator's commands. Monumental architecture was the original language of power, spoken by every early empire that shaped our world. By the end of this journey, you will see every ancient wonder not as a ruin, but as a deliberate, functioning machine of control. How did a building's alignment with a star prove a king's divine right? What secret knowledge was locked inside walls that took generations to build? We are about to pull back the curtain on history's greatest stage sets. What do you believe is the most permanent mark a civilization can leave? That lone traveler crests a hill and sees it for the first time. A structure so vast it seems to grow from the earth itself, a silhouette against the sky that was not there before. No guide is needed, no translator. The message is immediate, bypassing reason and striking directly at a primal sense of awe and perhaps of fear. This is the foundational concept. Monumental architecture was not merely shelter or art. It was a language, and its first and most powerful word was power itself. Before treaties were written or laws were proclaimed, empires spoke through stone. They developed a complex, non-verbal dialect designed to broadcast a single, unifying ideology. The state is mighty. The ruler is divine. This order is permanent. As the archaeologist Bruce Trigger observed, the very act of building on such a scale was the message. To quarry, transport, and lift stones weighing hundreds of tons required the mobilization of thousands of people, a vast logistical network, and absolute central control. The project itself was a relentless, visible demonstration of the empire's organizational muscle and its uncontested right to command the labor and the lives of its population. This architectural language had a distinct grammar. Its first rule was scale, overwhelming, inhuman scale. A pyramid does not invite you in. It diminishes you, making you acutely aware of your own smallness and transience against its perceived eternity. The second rule was placement. Structures were positioned to dominate the physical and visual landscape, often on high ground or at strategic crossroads, becoming unavoidable landmarks that reinforced state presence in every daily glance. The third rule was material. Using exclusive, often imported stone like granite or marble was a deliberate choice. An Egyptian obelisk carved from distant Aswan granite was not just a monument. It was a trophy. Its journey of hundreds of miles was a silent boast of economic reach and logistical mastery, proving the empire's influence extended far beyond the horizon the viewer could see. Together, this grammar created a total psychological environment. It made abstract power tangible, visible, and seemingly unassailable. The ruler's authority was no longer just an idea. It was the very ground you stood on and the shadow that fell over you. It felt less like a political system and more like a law of nature. This silent, stone dialect became the essential tool for any emerging empire seeking to cement its rule. And to see this language spoken with full, terrifying fluency, we must turn to the first true masters of this craft, an empire that built its legitimacy not just on conquest, but on calculated, breathtaking spectacle. The world's first empire builders understood this language of stone intuitively. In the fertile plains between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, the Sumerians of ancient Mesopotamia faced a unique challenge. Their landscape was flat, featureless, a vast expanse of mud and sky. Power here could not be asserted by claiming a mountain. It had to be invented. And so they built their own. The Ziggurat of Ur was not a tomb but a bridge, a colossal tiered pyramid of baked brick, rising in majestic steps toward the heavens. Its purpose was to create a new, artificial geography of authority. The historian Gwendolyn Lake explains that this immense height was a deliberate statement. It placed the temple at the summit physically closer to the realm of the gods, making it the sole channel for divine communication. This was a brilliant architectural strategy. By monopolizing the connection to the heavens, the priesthood, who acted on behalf of the king, monopolized the very source of truth and law. The Ziggurat was far more than a place of prayer. It was the administrative, economic, and intellectual CPU of the entire city-state. Within its lower levels and surrounding complexes, the priestly class conducted the business of empire. They distributed grain rations from the temple storehouses, recorded commercial transactions on clay tablets, and observed the stars from its high platforms. This is where early writing, astronomy, and mathematics were not just studied, but actively employed as tools of governance. Knowledge of the calendar told farmers when to plant, a power that controlled the food supply. Records of taxes and trade quantified the kingdom's wealth. The building itself was a physical repository of this specialized knowledge, inaccessible to the common person below. Its construction was a masterclass in social engineering. The process of molding millions of mud bricks, organizing teams of laborers, and coordinating the supply chain was a state-mandated project that required every citizen's participation. This communal labor did not just build a temple, it built a collective identity centered on submission to a divine order, with the king and his priests at its apex. The Ziggurat's design was a map of the universe. Each ascending tier represented a higher plane of existence, from the earthly realm to the celestial. To climb it was a ritual journey, a progression through levels of purity and knowledge permitted only to a select few. For the average citizen looking up from the sweltering streets, that towering silhouette against the sky was a constant, quiet reminder. All authority, all knowledge, and all connection to the divine flowed downward from that single man-made point. The landscape itself had been engineered to center and control. This Mesopotamian model proved that architecture could manufacture a sacred geography where none existed, creating an unassailable axis for both spiritual and bureaucratic power. It raises a compelling question. If a civilization could build a mountain to reach the gods, what other realities could they construct simply by rearranging stone? But that mastery of the landscape went far deeper than simply building on it. The earth was not a passive canvas. To these early architects, it was a living body, pulsing with unseen currents and energies. Their monuments were not placed at random. They were precisely positioned like acupuncture needles to tap into what they perceived as the world's vital force. This sophisticated art was geomancy, the science of sacred placement. It was the ultimate fusion of observed knowledge and spiritual belief, and it became a non-negotiable blueprint for imperial power. A ruler did not just claim a territory. He had to align himself with its hidden rhythms to prove his reign was written into the very fabric of the land and sky. This required a profound understanding of the natural world. Long before vast empires arose, earlier cultures demonstrated this principle with breathtaking clarity. Consider the rolling plains of Salisbury. The great stones of Stonehenge were hauled over impossible distances and erected in a complex arrangement that precisely marks the solstices. On the dry plateaus of Peru, the Nazca people carved immense, intricate glyphs of animals and geometric shapes into the desert floor, designs only fully comprehensible from the sky. These were not mere artworks, they were landscape-scale calendars and ritual maps designed to synchronize human activity with celestial and seasonal cycles. They represent a foundational discovery that by mapping astronomical events onto the Earth, you could symbolically capture cosmic time itself. Empires would later adopt and weaponize this concept. When an Egyptian pharaoh commissioned a pyramid, its design was a geodetic machine. The precision of its cardinal alignment to true north, the slant of its internal passages, these were feats of engineering rooted in celestial observation. An archaeoastronomer might explain that a pyramid's passageway oriented to catch the first ray of the winter solstice sunrise did more than create a beautiful light show. It demonstrated in stone the king's privileged knowledge. He could predict the sun's rebirth, the turning of the season, the guarantee of the Nile's flood. By architecturally harnessing this cycle, he presented himself as the indispensable mediator between the chaotic forces of nature and the survival of his people. His power was as reliable as the sunrise. This logic extended to every feature of the land. The choice of a building site was a deliberate act of geopolitical and spiritual claiming. A temple built upon a specific mountain peak sanctified that territory by linking it to a deity believed to reside there. A city founded at the confluence of two great rivers claimed the fertile junction as a divine mandate for prosperity. Even a cave, seen as an entrance to the underworld, could be incorporated into a palace complex, suggesting the ruler had influence over the realms of the departed. Through geomancy, the entire empire was gradually transformed into a stage. Every mountain, river, and valley became a prop in a continuous divine play where the ruler was both lead actor and director. The landscape itself whispered the script of his legitimacy, but a stage is nothing without its crew. These visions of sacred geography and cosmic alignment remained mere drawings in the sand without the army of minds and hands tasked with their realization. The true magic and the true cost lay in the act of building itself. The silent stones of a pyramid tell only half the story. The true monument was the living, breathing machine that built it. To move a 2-ton block of granite, you needed more than ropes and ramps. You needed a society meticulously reorganized into a single, purpose-built engine. This was the empire's second, more intimate language of control, spoken not in stone but in the seasonal rhythms of human labor. For generations, a romanticized image has persisted of countless enslaved souls driven by the whip to erect these wonders. Modern archaeology paints a far more complex and in some ways more revealing picture. Excavations around the Giza Plateau have uncovered not just tombs but entire cities for the builders. These were organized settlements with bakeries producing thousands of loaves, breweries, dormitories, and medical facilities treating injuries. This was not a prison camp. It was a state-run, large-scale logistical operation. The workforce, as Egyptologists like Mark Lehner have shown, was likely composed of skilled artisans and a rotating corvée labor force. Corvée labor was a tax paid not in grain but in time and muscle. For months each year, when the Nile's floodwaters covered the fields and farming ceased, the state summoned its citizens. This was a stroke of social genius. It converted idle time into productive energy, turning a period of potential unrest into a season of monumental achievement. The economic historian Carl Polanyi might describe this as a system of redistribution. The state collected grain through taxation, then fed, housed, and supplied the very laborers who were building the state's eternal symbols. It was a closed, self-perpetuating loop of power. The Pyramid Project was, in essence, a vast public works program that circulated resources and kept the entire economic engine humming. But the impact went deeper than economics. Imagine being a farmer from a remote village. You arrive at the royal site, one among tens of thousands. You are given a specific task as part of a team hauling a sled or dressing a stone. Your labor is coordinated with military precision by scribes and overseers who possess knowledge you do not. For the first time, you are part of something immeasurably larger than yourself. The shared hardship, the collective rhythm of the work, the visible daily progress all fostered a powerful new identity, a sense of we built this. This communal pride was the state's most potent tool. It blurred the line between coercion and participation, transforming a tax obligation into a perceived civic and religious duty. The monument became a collective possession, even as it eternally celebrated a single divine king. The administrative knowledge required to run this human engine was itself a form of monumental power. To schedule the rotations, calculate the food rations, manage the quarries, and coordinate the transport required a bureaucratic machine as impressive as the pyramid it built. The clay tablets and papyrus scrolls that tracked every loaf of bread and every work shift were the invisible architecture holding the entire endeavor aloft. This system did more than construct a tomb. It constructed a society accustomed to taking direction, one that saw the state's hand in every aspect of life, from the harvest to the horizon. The pyramid's shadow stretched across the land long before the final capstone was set. Yet, for all this logistical mastery, moving stone and managing people were ultimately physical acts. The true sorcery, the magic that made the impossible seem inevitable, resided in a different kind of capital altogether. It lived in the minds of the architects who could make a mountain obey the stars. A monument was more than a symbol, it was a storage device. In an age before paper was common and long before digital archives, how did an empire preserve the information vital to its survival? It carved its memory into the landscape itself. Monumental architecture became the ultimate information technology system, a three-dimensional library built to withstand centuries. The knowledge it held was not merely decorative, it was operational, encoding the very rules that kept society functioning. The most famous key to this ancient data vault is a fragment. The Rosetta Stone was not originally a museum piece, but a public decree, one of many copies erected in temple courtyards across Egypt. Its power lay in its triple script, repeating the same royal proclamation in hieroglyphs, Demotic, and Greek. This was not just translation, it was a calculated act of narrative control. By broadcasting the pharaoh's edict in the sacred script of the priests, the administrative script of the scribes, and the common script of the ruling Ptolemaic elite, the state ensured its version of events, its laws, and its divine legitimacy were the only version accessible to every literate class. The monument itself was the broadcast tower. This explicit knowledge carved for all to see was only the surface layer. Deeper still was what scholars call embedded knowledge. This is the information woven into the very fabric of the structure, invisible to the untrained eye. The precise mathematical ratio of a pyramid's height to its perimeter, which some researchers suggest may encode advanced geometric principles. The specific alignment of a temple doorway so that the rising sun illuminates the inner sanctum only on the king's coronation anniversary, a celestial timestamp. These were not accidents but deliberate, sophisticated codes written in geometry and astronomy. An epigrapher, a specialist in ancient inscriptions, might point out that the medium was part of the message. High-relief carvings on a towering pylon, visible but unreadable from the ground below, were a perfect metaphor for this hierarchy of understanding. The common citizen could see the images, grasp the general majesty, but the detailed narrative, the specific spells or historical accounts, remained the exclusive domain of the literate priesthood who could ascend the platform or access the inner chambers. This created a powerful social filter. Full comprehension was a privilege, physically and intellectually reserved for the elite who served the state. Yet there was another, even more elusive form of knowledge at work, one that left no inscriptions at all: tacit knowledge. This was the living, breathing expertise of the master builders, the secret recipes for mortar that hardened underwater, the ingenious techniques for moving megaliths, the intuitive understanding of stress and weight distribution learned over a lifetime and passed down through closed guilds. This know-how was the empire's most valuable trade secret, a form of power so essential it could not be risked on a clay tablet. It was stored in the minds and hands of a protected class of artisans, and its ultimate proof was the flawless, enduring structure itself. When we view a silent ruin today, we are not looking at a dead building. We are looking at a frozen conversation. The explicit text shout the official story. The embedded ratios whisper the esoteric sciences, and the sheer fact of its impossible construction shouts the lost manual of the master mason. These structures were active participants in a civilization's intellectual life, designed to preserve, protect, and control access to its collective mind. To see this principle operating at its most majestic scale, we must turn to a building that was not a tomb or a temple, but a fortress for knowledge itself. The Nile Valley was a stage set for eternity, a slender green ribbon of life bound on both sides by the endless, silent desert. In this starkly defined world, the Egyptians performed the most ambitious act of storytelling in human history, using not papyrus, but pyramids and temples to write a single, unshakable truth into the very skyline. The pharaoh was not just a king, he was the linchpin of the cosmos, and his monuments were the physical proof. This was not mere architecture, it was applied theology, a three-dimensional argument for a divine order that held chaos at bay. To understand how this worked, we must look beyond the pyramid as a tomb and see it as a machine, a resurrection engine designed with terrifying precision. The entire complex, from the towering structure itself to the adjacent mortuary temples and causeways, functioned as a single, integrated unit. Its purpose was to facilitate the king's journey to the afterlife and, crucially, to sustain his spirit forever. This required a perpetual cult of maintenance. Priests, funded by vast endowments of land and labor, performed daily rituals within the temple, offering food, drink, and incense to the pharaoh's statue. This system created an unbreakable chain. The king's eternal life depended on the priesthood. The priesthood's wealth and authority depended on the king's endowment. The state's legitimacy depended on the successful functioning of this entire cycle. It was a perfect, self-reinforcing loop of power, economics, and belief, all anchored in stone. As Egyptologist John Baines has articulated, the choice of material was itself a declaration. Granite and limestone were not just durable, they were a direct rebuttal to decay and disorder. In a world of mudbrick and shifting sands, these monuments stood as islands of absolute, unchanging order, projecting the pharaoh's control across millennia. The knowledge required to build this eternal argument was staggering, and it was all state secret. Teams of astronomers observed the stars for years to achieve the near-perfect cardinal alignment of a pyramid's sides, tethering the king's house to the unchanging north. Scribes and mathematicians performed complex calculations to determine the exact slope, the seat, that would give the structure its iconic form. Geologists identified the finest quarries, and engineers devised systems to extract blocks weighing hundreds of tons. Then came the hydrology, the mastery of the Nile itself. The river was not just a source of life, it was the empire's central highway. Stones were loaded onto massive barges during the annual inundation, when the high water brought the quarries and building sites closer together, turning the landscape into a temporary, state-controlled maritime network. This was logistics as a divine science, but the message was not only in the mass, it was in the minute details. Inside the temples, every wall was a page of eternal propaganda. Endless reliefs show the pharaoh in a state of perfect ritual action, smiting foreign enemies or making offerings to the gods. These were not historical records in our sense. They were declarations of ideal reality, performed over and over in stone. They told the literate elite, and through them the populace, a single story. The king is the maintainer of Mat, the cosmic balance. He is the sole intermediary who keeps the Nile flowing and the sun rising. The temple walls made this abstract theological principle tangible, something you could walk beside and touch. The entire civilization became an immersive environment designed to prove one idea. This architectural program was so effective, so deeply embedded in the landscape and the psyche, that it created a state ideology stable enough to last for thousands of years. It prompts a profound question. What kind of tools did these ancient minds wield to translate such a grand cosmic vision into such flawlessly precise stone? A 70-ton stone obelisk lies in a desert quarry, a seemingly immovable declaration of ambition. The puzzle for the ancient engineer was not just moving it, but bending the very laws of physics to his will. His solution was a masterpiece of applied, practical science. He would construct a massive wooden sledge beneath the monolith. Then, teams of laborers would pour water or perhaps a slick slurry of clay ahead of the runners, dramatically reducing friction. With coordinated pulling along a prepared track, the impossible mass would begin to glide. For the final, vertical lift onto a waiting barge, an earthen ramp would be built, turning an insurmountable cliff into a manageable, gradual incline. This was not magic, it was physics made manifest, a quiet triumph of leverage, lubrication, and logistics that turned raw geology into a political statement. This intimate command over the physical world was a form of proprietary knowledge as guarded as any state secret. The choice of material itself was a language. It was not enough to build big, you had to build with meaning. An Egyptian pharaoh did not simply want a statue. He demanded one carved from the deep red granite of Aswan, a stone quarried over 400 miles upstream. A Mesopotamian king would inlay a temple doorway with lapis lazuli, a vivid blue stone whose nearest source was in the distant mountains of Afghanistan. This practice, which scholars call materiality, was a direct display of aesthetic authority and economic reach. Using these materials was a silent, potent boast. It declared, our trade networks stretch to the ends of the known earth, and we command the finest it has to offer. Materials scientists today can explain the very practical reasons behind these choices. Granite and basalt were prized not just for their beauty, but for their incredible compressive strength and resistance to weathering. They were, quite literally, stones of eternity. The symbolic value of color was equally critical. Lapis lazuli mirrored the night sky, connecting the ruler to the cosmos. Green schist evoked fertility and regeneration. The material was never just a block, it was a pixel in a larger ideological image. Turning that pixel into a monument required a supply chain of staggering complexity. A single royal project could trigger a logistical cascade that lasted for generations. Quarrying expeditions were state-funded military campaigns in all but name, sending thousands of workers, scribes, and soldiers into remote regions for years. They did not just cut stone, they built entire temporary cities in the desert, with bakeries, wells, and administrative offices to support the operation. Then came the transport, an even greater feat. For the Egyptians, this meant mastering the Nile's flood cycle. They would dig canals from the river to the quarry face, waiting for the annual inundation to float the massive blocks onto barges. They were turning a natural phenomenon into a seasonal conveyor belt for their ambition. In the Andes, the Inca built extensive, paved road systems through impossible terrain, solely for the purpose of moving construction materials and imperial messages. The tools of this transformation were marvels of early engineering. In Egypt, craftsmen used copper and later bronze saws, armed with abrasive quartz sand, to slice through granite. Tube drills, hollow reeds spun with sand, allowed for the precise carving of hieroglyphs and statues. In the Americas, the Inca shaped their iconic, earthquake-resistant masonry with stone hammers and bronze chisels, then locked the blocks together with molten metal poured into precisely carved channels, a technique akin to giant stone puzzle pieces fused with metal. This mastery of materials from quarry to final, seamless joint was the ultimate demonstration of control. It proved the empire could not only command people, but could subdue and reshape nature itself. The mountain was made to move, the river was made to carry it, and the hardest stone was made to obey. If they could map their will onto the very bones of the earth, what was to stop them from doing the same to the vault of heaven? The sun did not merely rise. On one specific morning of the year, it performed. at the Great Pyramid of Kukulkan at Chichen Itza, as the spring equinox sun descended, a play of light and shadow would crawl down the northern staircase. For a fleeting, perfect moment, the geometry of the steps would form the undulating body of a feathered serpent, connecting the temple at the summit to the earth below. This was not a happy accident. It was a celestial appointment written in stone centuries in advance. The grandest monuments of the ancient world often functioned as colossal clocks and calendars, their primary purpose to anchor an empire not just to a piece of land, but to the very machinery of the cosmos. By doing so, they proved the ruling elite possessed the ultimate knowledge, the schedule of the gods themselves. This intimate fusion of astronomy and architecture transformed a building from a static symbol into a dynamic, predictable spectacle of power. The architects of this cosmic connection were the priest astronomers, with seemingly simple tools like the gnomon, a vertical stick that casts a shadow. These scholars could chart the sun's wandering path with astonishing accuracy. They tracked the points on the horizon where it rose and set, marking the solstices and equinoxes, the fundamental pillars of the agricultural year. This hard-won data was then embedded permanently into the orientation of a temple's doorway or the axis of an entire city. Historians of science note that this predictive capability was a political weapon of immense force. In a world where the sun's return after the winter solstice was a matter of life and death, the ruler who could announce its exact date and then stage a dramatic light show within his sacred building to prove it was not just a king. He was a miracle worker, a mediator who could apparently command the sky. These alignments served a complex web of purposes. At the most practical level, they set the agricultural calendar, telling farmers precisely when to plant and harvest, making the state the indispensable source of life-giving information. They also timed religious festivals, concentrating the population at the monument for rituals that reinforced social unity under divine sanction. But on a symbolic level, they performed the most important task of all, visually connecting the ruler to celestial bodies. In Egypt, the pharaoh was closely associated with the star Sirius, whose heliacal rising just before dawn heralded the Nile's annual flood. His pyramid, aligned to cardinal points and specific stars, was his permanent launchpad to join that eternal circuit. The building literally mapped his destiny onto the night sky. Different cultures tuned their stone instruments to different celestial frequencies. Solar alignments, like those at Stonehenge or the Temple of Karnak, tracked the sun's cycle, marking the rhythm of the seasons. Lunar alignments, important for cultures that used moon-based calendars, can be seen in sites like the stepped pyramids of ancient Mesopotamia. Stellar alignments, often targeting the pole star or constellations like Orion, spoke of eternity and the soul's journey. Each alignment was a deliberate choice, a statement about what that culture valued most in the cosmos. This celestial engineering provided an unassailable, divine rationale for the entire social order. If the king's palace was aligned with the sun god's path, then the hierarchy it represented was not a human invention, but a reflection of cosmic law. The architecture became a clockwork of power, its gears turning in sync with the heavens, making rebellion seem not just treasonous but sacrilegious, a rebellion against nature itself. This intricate, sky-bound blueprint for legitimacy, however, required a society on the ground meticulously organized to maintain it. The silent, ticking clock of the monument demanded a human mechanism to wind it. The city itself was the ultimate monument, a living machine built to think for you. Every street, every wall, every open plaza was a carefully placed cog in an engine designed to manufacture consent through daily experience. This was the spatial grammar of control, where urban planning became a silent, relentless teacher of social hierarchy. To walk through an imperial capital was to read a three-dimensional map of power, one that choreographed your movements, your sightlines, and your very understanding of where you belonged. Primary tool in this grammar was axiality. Think of a vast, dead straight avenue like the Street of the Dead in Teotihuacan or the central axis of ancient Chang'an. This was no mere thoroughfare. It was a visual arrow, an uncompromising line of sight that pulled your gaze and your body inexorably toward a single point, the temple or palace complex at its end. The architecture did not suggest, it commanded. Look here, move here. Your destination and your purpose were preordained by the pavement beneath your feet. This axial logic was paired with the principle of elevation. Important structures were never on level ground. They were placed atop towering platforms, artificial mountains, or fortified hills. To approach the Forbidden City in Beijing, you didn't just walk, you ascended, passing through a series of gates and courtyards, each step upward a metaphor for moving closer to a rarefied plane of existence. The climb was a physical lesson in deference, making you literally look up to authority. Your aching legs were a constant reminder of the distance between you and the throne. Then came the mechanisms of controlled access, the gates, walls, and checkpoints that filtered the flow of human traffic. In the Inca capital of Cusco, the city was divided into upper and lower sectors, Honan and Hurin, a cosmological division mirrored in stone. Commoners lived in the lower, outer districts, while the sacred core, with its Coricancha temple and royal compounds, was reserved for the elite and the priesthood. You could not simply wander in. Your access was a function of your status, enforced by guards and geography. Urban archaeologists describe cities like these as cosmograms, miniature models of the empire and the universe. The layout was a symbolic map. The palace represented the axis mundi, the world's center. The main avenues mirrored celestial pathways. The concentric rings of walls stood for the ordered layers of creation, from the chaotic outside world to the perfectly arranged heart of power. This design was a continuous, passive enforcement of ideology. You didn't need to read a law code to know the rules. You felt them in the length of your walk, the height you were allowed to reach, the gates that opened or closed before you. Zoning meticulously separated classes. The cramped, organic lanes of the commoners' quarters, designed for practicality, stood in stark contrast to the geometric precision and spacious luxury of the elite districts. This physical segregation prevented the mixing of classes and made the privileges of power visibly, tangibly different. But the city was not just for containment, it was for spectacle. On festival days, the axial processional ways transformed into stages. The ruler, adorned in divine regalia, would move along this sacred route in a slow, choreographed parade, visible to the masses lining the streets yet separated by elevation and guard. This ritual movement displayed the sovereign as a living icon, a piece of sacred architecture in motion, reinforcing the connection between his person and the monumental space he commanded. The defensive walls surrounding the city served a dual symbolic purpose. To those inside, they promised protection from external chaos. To those outside, or to lower classes within, they were a stark symbol of separation, a clear line between the ordered world of the empire and everything else. This spatial management turned the entire capital into a classroom that never closed, its curriculum written in brick and stone. Every day, from sunrise to sunset, the city taught its inhabitants the same lesson, preparing them for the final, most persuasive lesson of all, the stories that would be performed within these controlled spaces. The walls did not whisper, they shouted in color. Imagine standing before an Egyptian temple not as a sun-bleached ruin, but as it was intended, a blazing canvas of brilliant blues, radiant reds, and shimmering gold leaf. Every surface told a story in pigment, a cinematic spectacle for a population where few could read the hieroglyphs below. This was the empire's original broadcast network, a visual language of power painted directly onto the architecture of daily life. The iconography was not decoration, it was a meticulously standardized vocabulary. A pharaoh was always shown larger than other figures, his posture rigid and eternal, 1 foot forward in a stance of controlled action. A conquered enemy was eternally depicted in a posture of submission beneath the ruler's feet or bound at his throne. A god always held a specific attribute, a scepter or an ankh, a visual shorthand for their domain. This created an instantly recognizable grammar across hundreds of miles and generations. You did not need to be literate to understand the message. The image itself was the law. Art historians note that this repetition was not a lack of creativity, but a deliberate strategy. By seeing the same scene of the king making an offering to a deity, or the same tableau of imperial soldiers victorious in battle, carved on temple after temple, the viewer experienced a normalization of the established order. It presented the hierarchy not as a political choice, but as a natural, unchanging fact, as permanent as the stone it was carved upon. The placement of these images was a masterclass in psychological targeting. At the gateways to palaces and temples stood colossal guardian figures like the Assyrian Lamashu, those immense winged bulls with human heads. Their purpose was twofold: to magically protect the threshold and to overwhelm any visitor with a visceral sense of awe and intimidation before they even stepped inside. You were literally entering under the gaze of the empire's power. Deeper within, in the inner courtyards and halls accessible only to priests and elites, the imagery shifted. Here, detailed narrative friezes covered the walls, depicting complex rituals, historical chronicles, or intricate theological scenes. This was knowledge for the initiated, reinforcing the idea that full understanding of the state's divine mandate was a privilege earned by proximity and status. On the exterior, facing the public square, were the heraldic emblems, the clear, bold symbols of dynasty and dominion. A Roman triumphal arch, for instance, was not a simple gateway. It was a billboard carved from spoils of war, its surfaces crowded with scenes of captured weapons, subdued nations, and the emperor presiding over the victory parade. It transformed military success into a permanent civic ornament, weaving conquest directly into the fabric of the city's memory. This stone propaganda was inescapable. It shaped collective identity by providing a single, state-approved version of history, law, and divine right. The stories it told became the stories people remembered, the only stories the environment allowed them to see every day. The empire's truth was not just taught, it was built into the walls you leaned against and the gates you passed through. But this control over the senses was not complete with sight alone. To fully immerse a population in its reality, the state had to command what they heard. The silence within a pyramid's burial chamber was a carefully engineered illusion. Step inside the Great Gallery, a soaring, corbelled corridor leading to the king's final resting place, and even the softest whisper would transform. It would slide along the polished limestone walls, gathering strength, bouncing upward into the darkness until it returned not as a human sound, but as a low, resonant hum, seeming to emanate from the stones themselves. This was no accident. The power of these spaces was a full-body experience, a manipulation of the senses that went far beyond sight. Ancient architects were master acoustic engineers, designing chambers and plazas not just to be seen, but to be heard in very specific, awe-inspiring ways. This sonic dimension, the study of archaeoacoustics, reveals how controlled soundscapes could convince participants of a supernatural presence, adding a profound layer of legitimacy to every ritual. Imagine a single drumbeat struck in the center of the vast, stone-paved plaza at Teotihuacan. The sound would not fade, it would ripple outward, hitting the steep slopes of the Pyramid of the Moon and rolling back in a wave of echoes, creating the sensation that the earth itself was answering. Or consider the famous chirping echo on the staircase of the Kukulkan Pyramid at Chichen Itza. A hand clap at the base produces a sharp, bird-like chirp that seems to flutter up the steps toward the temple. Researchers studying this phenomenon suggest the precise spacing of the steps acts like a sound diffraction grating, breaking the clap into a rapid series of reflections that our ears perceive as a chirp. To a participant in a ceremony, this was not physics, it was magic, a direct auditory sign from the feathered serpent deity. The tools of this acoustic control were built into the architecture itself. Corbelled vaults, like those in Mycenaean tombs, created parabolic shapes that could focus sound to a single point, allowing a priest's chant to be heard with startling clarity from anywhere in the chamber. The choice of material was critical. Polished limestone, plastered walls, and ceramic tiles are highly reflective, turning enclosed spaces into resonant boxes. In contrast, open plazas surrounded by towering structures created vast reverberant fields, where the combined chants of thousands would blend into a single, overwhelming drone, dissolving individual identity into collective fervor. This mastery of sound was used with surgical precision. At the Oracle of Delphi in Greece, the priestess, the Pythia, would deliver her prophecies from a small, enclosed chamber deep within the temple. Some scholars propose that natural fissures in the rock beneath her seat may have released light gases that induced a trance state, but the architecture played its part. The chamber's acoustics could have amplified her whispers and breaths, distorting them into otherworldly sounds for the priests in an adjacent room to interpret. The message was thus filtered through layers of stone and mystery, its divine origin seemingly confirmed by the very strangeness of its delivery. Conversely, the design could enforce silence. The thick, rubble-filled walls of a palace's administrative wing would deaden sound, creating a hushed atmosphere of solemn authority, a stark contrast to the roaring crowds outside. This control over the sensory environment made the architectural experience fully immersive. You didn't just watch a ritual, you were swallowed by it. The directed whisper proved mystical knowledge. The overwhelming noise of the mass ceremony induced a collective emotional trance. The strategic silence commanded reverence. By choreographing not just movement but sound, the state demonstrated its command over an invisible yet deeply felt dimension of reality. To experience this total sensory engineering at its most ambitious scale, we must cross an ocean. In the Americas, entire mountains were reshaped into instruments of power, creating a new world symphony written in earth and stone. The mountains themselves became the empire's greatest ally. In the thin air of the Andes, the Inca faced a challenge no other civilization had mastered on such a scale: how to unite a vast, vertical world of jagged peaks, deep valleys, and isolated communities. Their answer was a monumental language not of intimidation, but of seamless integration. They spoke through stone, but their grammar was one of connection, utility, and breathtaking adaptation. While Egyptian pyramids shouted a pharaoh's divinity, Inca architecture performed a quieter, more insistent function. It wove a disparate realm into a single, functioning organism through sheer, practical genius. The foundation of this system was a concept called the mitta. This was not slavery, but a rotational labor tax, a duty owed to the state. In exchange for their work, communities received security, access to state-run feasts, and the benefits of the very infrastructure they built. It was a reciprocal obligation that bound every citizen to the imperial project, turning the act of construction into a shared civic and social ritual. This mobilized workforce was deployed with stunning efficiency to build the empire's circulatory system, the Qhapaq or Royal Road. This was not a single path, but a network of over 25,000 miles of paved highways, stairways, and suspension bridges woven through impossible terrain. It connected ocean coasts to cloud forests, allowing imperial runners, the chasquis, to relay messages from Quito to Cusco in under a week. Along these roads, at precise intervals, the state built tambos, way stations that served as administrative centers, barracks, and storehouses. This infrastructure turned geography from an enemy into a tool, enabling the rapid movement of troops, information, and, most importantly, goods. The redistribution of those goods was the empire's lifeblood, and architecture made it possible. On strategic hillsides, the Inca constructed long rows of identical, circular storehouses called Qhapaq. Their clever design, with ventilation systems and elevated foundations, preserved vast quantities of maize, potatoes, and textiles. As scholar Terence Daltroy has emphasized, this was the physical manifestation of the state's promise. In times of local crop failure, these storehouses could release supplies, demonstrating the tangible benefit of belonging to the empire. The state giveth because the state hath efficiently stored, but the most iconic symbol of Inca power is their stonework. At sites like Sacsayhuaman or the terraces of Machu Picchu, you see walls built from massive, irregular blocks, each one painstakingly shaped to fit perfectly with its neighbors, all without a drop of mortar. This technique, known as ashlar masonry, was far more than an aesthetic choice. In an earthquake-prone land, these interlocking stones would dance during a tremor and then settle back into place, while rigid, mortared walls would crumble. This was a profound architectural metaphor. The empire, like its walls, was designed to be flexible yet unbreakable, its diverse peoples locked together into a resilient whole that could withstand any shock. Every construction project in a newly conquered territory was an act of political implantation. The state would send in its Mita laborers to build standardized administrative compounds, sun temples, and most critically, vast agricultural terraces. These terraces did more than grow food. They permanently reshaped the land in the Inca image. They increased arable land, yes, but they also demonstrated the state's power to improve and order even the most rebellious slopes. A community that received these terraces became physically and economically dependent on the imperial system that built and maintained them. The architecture was the state, made visible and indispensable. It provided the roads, the food security, and the sacred spaces, creating a web of practical benefits that made resistance seem not only dangerous, but irrational. The Inca model reveals a fascinating inversion. While most empires used monuments to separate the elite from the masses, the Inca used infrastructure to bind everyone into a single, interdependent system. Their power was not locked away in a tomb. It flowed along the roads and grew on the terraces. It prompts us to consider the opposite architectural impulse. If an empire could build to connect and integrate, what did it build to hide, to protect, and to keep utterly, permanently secret? Torchlight flickers against walls no common citizen will ever see. In a windowless chamber deep within a temple's heart, a priest-king performs a ritual known only to himself and the gods. The air is still, thick with incense and silence. For the vast majority, the empire's power was displayed on sunlit plazas and towering facades, but its true essence, its most dangerous secrets, were always kept in the dark. This was the architecture of secrecy, where inaccessibility itself became a definitive tool of control. What is hidden is instinctively perceived as more valuable, more potent, more true. By building literal barriers around certain knowledge, early empires cultivated an aura of exclusivity that made their authority seem not just political but mystical. Anthropologists who study these spaces note a universal pattern. From the labyrinthine crypts beneath Egyptian temples to the subterranean ceremonial kivas of the ancestral pueblones, architectural complexity was used to stage the revelation of knowledge. These were not just rooms, they were scripts for an experience. To access the inner sanctum, an initiate had to navigate a physical and psychological journey. A typical temple was designed as a series of progressive chambers, each more restrictive than the last. You would move from the bright, crowded outer courtyard, through a columned hall dimmer and quieter, past a heavy curtain or a guarded gate, and finally into a small, dark room housing the cult statue or sacred relic. This spatial sequence physically mapped the path to enlightenment or power. The deeper you went, the fewer people accompanied you, until you stood utterly alone before the mystery. This design manufactured scarcity around truth. It taught that understanding was not free or immediate, but earned through gradual, guided progression under the state's careful supervision. The barriers themselves were rich with symbolism. A simple veil across a doorway was more than cloth. It was a boundary between the profane and the sacred. False doors carved into tomb walls served as symbolic portals for the spirit, inaccessible to the living, a permanent reminder of realms beyond mortal reach. Engineering joined symbolism in the form of complex locking mechanisms. The massive granite portcullis slabs in Egyptian pyramid passages, lowered by ropes from above, were as much about ritual seclusion as they were about security. They sealed the king's journey, making his final resting place a perfect, eternal secret. Even mythology was drafted into service. The carved guardians at gateways, the stories of curses protecting tombs, these were psychological locks, deterring intrusion with the threat of supernatural consequence. This deliberate obscurity created and sustained an elite class of knowledge keepers. The priesthood, the royal scribes, the master architects, these individuals held the keys, literal and metaphorical, to the empire's operational core. They understood the astronomical alignments, the sacred texts, the logistical blueprints. Their expertise, gained through long initiation and guarded by oath, made them indispensable. And at the apex of this pyramid of restricted knowledge stood the ruler. He was the ultimate gatekeeper, the one individual for whom all doors opened, the living embodiment of the final revelation. This system made his authority self-verifying. His power was legitimate because he had access to the secrets, and he had access to the secrets because his power was legitimate. The vast resources required for these monumental projects played directly into this economy of secrecy. Only a state with immense command over labor and materials could afford to build such extravagant hidden spaces. The sheer cost of constructing a labyrinthine tomb or a temple with multiple sealed sanctuaries was in itself a demonstration of power so vast it could afford to bury its most precious assets out of sight. The hidden chamber proved the empire's wealth more eloquently than any gold displayed in public, for it showed a surplus so great it could be rendered invisible. This architectural secrecy forged a powerful, self-sustaining loop. The mystery legitimized the elite controlled the knowledge, and the knowledge justified the endless expenditure that built ever more profound mysteries. It was a perfect closed circuit of power, hidden in plain sight behind a wall of stone and shadow. A pyramid's true cost was measured in bread. The most profound economic statement of an early empire was not a coin, but a grain silo positioned next to a stone quarry. This was the genius of monumental building as fiscal policy. By converting the state's collected surplus of food and materials into a single, spectacular, non-utilitarian project, rulers performed a masterful act of economic theater. They transformed passive wealth into active, visible power, proving they could command the entire economic cycle from collection to glorious, unproductive display. From an economist's perspective, this was a primitive but highly effective form of stimulus spending. The state gathered taxes in the form of grain, cloth, timber, and labor time. Hoarding these commodities risked spoilage and localized scarcity, but by funneling them into a decades-long construction project, the state put those resources back into circulation. It created demand for skilled artisans from stone carvers to carpenters. It employed teams of transporters, cooks, and overseers. It required the production of tools, ropes, and ceramics. This massive, state-directed investment acted like a pump, priming the economy and preventing the kind of hoarding that could lead to destabilizing price swings or social unrest. The grand project became a circulatory system for the empire's wealth. integrating distant regions through shared logistical needs. A quarry in the north supplied stone, a forest in the south supplied timber, and fertile central valleys supplied the food to feed everyone involved. The historian Carl Polanyi might describe this not as a market economy, but as a system of redistribution where the central authority collects and then reallocates resources to reinforce its own centrality. This process reached its most theatrical peak in the principle of the ceremonial giveaway or potlatch, scaled to an imperial level. The ruler demonstrated his supreme wealth not by having it, but by conspicuously, publicly spending or even destroying it. This created a web of social obligation and awe. Lavish feasts for tens of thousands of workers during a pyramid's dedication were not mere celebrations. They were a performance of boundless surplus. The act of entombing exquisite jewelry, ceremonial weapons, and piles of precious goods with a ruler was the ultimate economic spectacle. It declared that the state was so prosperous, so secure, it could afford to bury a fortune forever, removing it from any future human use. This visible conversion of usable wealth into a permanent, immovable symbol was a powerful deterrent to challengers. It demonstrated a surplus so vast it could be made literally untouchable. The monument itself, therefore, was a bank statement carved in stone. Its size was a direct index of the empire's extractive capacity. Every block represented taxes collected, labor commanded, and goods mobilized from across the realm. It stood as an immutable record of economic control, a display that the ruler was the irreplaceable prime mover of all prosperity. Yet this brilliant theater of abundance casts a long, inevitable shadow. The grain that fed the worker, the stone that awed the traveler, all of it flowed from a single, relentless source. The sweet scent of cedar was a luxury that traveled by sea. A single log felled in the mountains of Lebanon began an impossible journey. It was hauled to the coast, loaded onto a specially built ship, and sailed across the Mediterranean past pirates and storms to the Nile Delta. From there, it was transferred to a barge and towed upriver against the current, finally arriving at the royal dockyards of a desert kingdom. That log, destined to become a temple door or a pharaoh's sarcophagus, was more than wood. It was a geopolitical event. Its journey required treaties with foreign princes, armed convoys for protection, and the labor of countless unnamed individuals across multiple lands. The gleaming materials that defined imperial architecture were trophies of a hidden war, the silent evidence of a reach that extended far beyond the empire's official borders. Every block of imported stone, every sheet of hammered gold, every inlay of lapis lazuli was a pixel in a vast, unspoken map of extraction and influence. Trade archaeologists pieced together these routes like detectives. They traced the path of deep blue lapis lazuli, mined only in the remote valleys of Afghanistan, to the palaces of Mesopotamia and the tombs of Egypt. They followed tin from the mines of Cornwall or Anatolia, an essential alloy for bronze, to the weapon workshops of empires. These were not simple commercial exchanges. Controlling these supply chains was a high-stakes form of applied knowledge. It demanded cartography to know the routes, diplomacy to secure passage, and metallurgy to understand the material's value. A ruler who could clad his pyramid's peak in electrum, a mix of gold and silver, was broadcasting a terrifyingly simple message. My will is so absolute, it bends the very landscape of distant continents to my purpose. The methods of acquisition were as varied as the materials themselves. Tribute was the most direct form of political extraction, where conquered or vassal states were compelled to send specific resources as a sign of submission. Trade involved complex negotiations and the exchange of prestige goods, but was often backed by the implicit threat of force. And direct conquest, the most brutal method, simply seized the source, turning entire regions into imperial quarries or plantations. The disruption of one of these delicate chains could threaten a regime's very legitimacy. If the gold from Nubia stopped flowing, how could the pharaoh renew his divine, golden skin in the statues that dotted the land? If the cedar from Lebanon was cut off, how could the gods be housed in a manner worthy of their station? The architecture's symbolic power was utterly dependent on this continuous, vulnerable flow of distant wealth. This global dimension reveals a profound irony. The most iconic symbols of a civilization's internal unity and divine favor were often built with the assembled riches of the known world. A single Egyptian temple complex might contain Lebanese cedar, Nubian gold, Aegean silver, and Afghan lapis. It stood as a permanent museum of the empire's reach, a physical catalogue of every people and place it touched, influenced, or subsumed. The monument was not a closed loop. It was the glittering, concentrated endpoint of a vast and often harsh network that stretched to the horizon and beyond. It forces us to ask, what stories did these empires tell themselves to justify such staggering expenditure, to rationalize the immense human and material cost of turning a mountain into a message? The cord stretched taut between two stakes was not a tool, it was a divine echo. In the quiet before dawn, an architect-priest would use this simple rope to mark the foundation of a new temple. A ritual act he believed mirrored the moment the gods themselves measured the primordial chaos to bring forth order. This was the profound cosmological truth that justified everything. Monumental architecture was never just engineering. It was an act of sympathetic magic, a physical model built to convince everyone that the political order on Earth was a direct reflection of the sacred order of the cosmos. To challenge the king was not merely treason, it was to risk unraveling creation itself. At the heart of this belief stood a powerful, almost universal symbol, the axis mundi. This was the world's center, the still point around which the universe turned. In architecture, it became a central pyramid, a mountain temple, or a towering pillar. This structure served as a literal and symbolic linchpin, believed to connect three realms: the heavens above, the earthly plane, and the underworld below. The historian of religion Mircea Eliade described how occupying this symbolic center granted the ruler unparalleled authority. By placing his palace or his tomb upon this axis, he positioned himself as the sole conduit for cosmic forces, the indispensable mediator between the divine and the human. His city was not just a capital, it was the navel of the world. Different cultures developed their own intricate models to express this cosmic connection. In Egypt, the Djed pillar, a symbol resembling a backbone, was more than an icon. It represented stability, endurance, and the resurrected god Osiris. When a pharaoh raised a ceremonial Djed pillar in a temple ritual, or when the towering pillars of his hypostyle hall echoed its form, he was architecturally reinforcing his role as the guarantor of cosmic stability. In Mesopotamia, city plans and world maps often depicted the empire at the center of a circular world, surrounded by a bitter ocean and distant mythical lands. This cartography was not geographical error, it was ideological design, placing the king's domain at the very heart of all known existence. Far to the east, the Chinese applied the principles of feng shui, the wind and water, to imperial city planning. The orientation of Beijing's Forbidden City, its layout aligning with cardinal directions and specific landforms, was a meticulous effort to harness positive Chi, the vital life force of the earth and heavens. This ensured harmony, prosperity, and longevity for the dynasty. The emperor's throne sat at the precise focal point of these invisible currents, his authority flowing from his perfect alignment with the natural world's energy. These were not mere superstitions. They were sophisticated, coherent systems of knowledge that informed every decision, from a building's orientation to its precise proportions. They provided an unchallengeable, divine rationale for the entire social hierarchy. If the universe was a pyramid with a single peak touching the heavens, then a society modeled as a pyramid with a single ruler at its apex, was not a human invention, it was a cosmic imperative. The architecture made this abstract hierarchy tangible, a daily, visual lesson in natural law. This cosmological framework was so powerful, so deeply convincing, that it could compel generations to labor for a vision they would never see completed. Yet, even the most perfect cosmic blueprint is vulnerable to the winds of change. What happens when an empire built on one unchanging truth encounters a new idea or a new god from beyond its sacred borders? The soaring columns of Persepolis were not just Persian. Their fluted shafts and intricate bull capitals spoke a new, hybrid dialect of power, one stitched together from the visual vocabularies of Egypt, Babylon, and Greece. This was not a sign of weakness, but of a sophisticated imperial strategy. As empires expanded, their monumental architecture entered into a complex dialogue, borrowing, adapting, and remixing forms. This cross-cultural exchange revealed that the very definition of knowledge and power was not a static decree, but a dynamic, ongoing conversation across civilizations. The Persian Empire, under rulers like Darius and Xerxes, mastered this language of synthesis. At their ceremonial capital, they did not erase the artistic identities of the peoples they conquered. Instead, they deliberately incorporated them. Egyptian-inspired columned halls stood alongside Babylonian-style glazed brick reliefs, all executed by Ionian Greek stonemasons. The resulting architecture was a visual manifesto. It proclaimed that the Persian king was not a foreign destroyer, but a universal sovereign, the rightful heir and unifier of all the world's great traditions. His authority was legitimized through the familiar symbols of those he now ruled. This practice of architectural citation became a powerful tool of intellectual diplomacy and subtle domination. To build in a style recognizable to a conquered people was to say, "We understand you, we value your achievements, and now they belong to us." It transformed the symbols of a culture's pride into trophies of its submission, all while presenting the empire as inclusive and sophisticated. This flow of ideas was not one way. The Romans, brilliant engineers and pragmatists, were voracious adopters of superior technology. They did not invent the arch, but they observed its strength in Etruscan structures. Recognizing its potential, they absorbed the knowledge, refined it with concrete, and scaled it to monumental proportions, creating aqueducts, bridges, and the Colosseum. This was knowledge as a strategic resource. Adopting a better technique was not an admission of inferiority, but a demonstration of pragmatic intelligence and adaptive power. The empire proved it could identify excellence anywhere and make it its own. The most dramatic spread of an architectural language came with the conquests of Alexander the Great. As historian Andrew Stewart notes, the Hellenistic style, with its realistic sculpture, theatrical urban planning, and gymnasium-centered civic life, was exported from Greece to the borders of India. In places like Ai Khanum in modern Afghanistan, Greek temples and Corinthian columns arose not as impositions, but as the preferred aesthetic of a new cosmopolitan elite. This style became a badge of status, a visual code signaling participation in a vast, interconnected world of knowledge, commerce, and power. To build in the Greek manner was to claim a place in this new world order. These exchanges required a deep, studied knowledge of foreign symbols and building techniques. An empire had to understand what a specific column type meant to an Ionian Greek, or how a particular vault was engineered by a Mesopotamian builder in order to repurpose it effectively. This turned architecture into a living record of cultural interaction. Consider the serene Buddha statues from Gandhara, carved with the realistic folds of Greek drapery and the contemplative grace of Hellenistic sculpture. This Greco-Buddhist art was a profound fusion, using the visual language of one philosophical tradition to give form to the spiritual insights of another. Similarly, the Romans adopted the underground temple of Mithras, the Mithraeum, from Persian traditions, adapting its symbolic layout to serve the cult of their own soldiers across the empire. This adaptive knowledge demonstrated an empire's supreme confidence and sophistication. It showed an ability to absorb, to comprehend, and to repurpose the best the world had to offer. The resulting power could appear universal and inclusive, weaving diverse peoples into a single imperial tapestry. Yet the loom and the hand guiding the thread always remained firmly in control. This architectural flexibility made imperial power seem both timeless and inevitable, a force that could seamlessly integrate the past and the present of every culture it touched. But this magnificent, synthesized legacy, this empire of stone, faced a relentless and invisible enemy. A finished monument was only the beginning of its true work. Its power did not fossilize upon the setting of the final stone, but required a constant, living stream of attention to remain vital. Like a great engine, it needed perpetual fueling, a continuous performance of state commitment enacted through ritual, repair, and active memory. This created a long-term, almost contractual relationship between the structure and the society that built it, one that could last for centuries and drain resources for just as long. Visualize the scene at an Egyptian temple during the annual Opet festival. The statue of the god housed in the temple's deepest, darkest sanctuary was not a static idol. It was believed to be a living vessel. Priests would perform a daily ritual, the opening of the mouth, a symbolic reanimation where they touched the statue's lips with ceremonial tools, offered it food, drink, and incense, and dressed it in fresh linen. This was not mere upkeep. It was a daily reconsecration, a vital act that maintained the god's presence in the world, and by extension, the pharaoh's divine mandate. The monument demanded this care as a divine obligation. To neglect it was to risk the god's departure, which would mean the withdrawal of divine favor, the failure of the Nile flood, and the collapse of cosmic order. The building itself held agency. It made demands. This perspective, drawn from anthropological studies of material culture, suggests that people in these societies often saw sacred structures as having a kind of biography, a life cycle intertwined with the fate of the kingdom. Cracks in a temple wall were not just weathering. They could be interpreted as signs of divine displeasure. The collapse of a ceremonial gateway might be remembered as the omen that preceded a military defeat. The monument's physical condition became a direct barometer for the health of the state. This belief system necessitated the creation of permanent, self-sustaining institutions solely dedicated to maintenance. Vast tracts of agricultural land were endowed to temples, their harvests funding the priesthood, the craftsmen, and the supplies needed for endless ritual and repair. A specialized class of mason priests knew the secret recipes for the temple's specific plaster or the precise chanting required to soothe a settling foundation. This turned every pyramid, every ziggurat into a perpetual economic and social engine. The initial construction project might last a generation, but the system of care it spawned could last for millennia. It created guaranteed hereditary employment for scribes to manage the endowment accounts, for priests to perform the rites, and for artisans to execute the repairs. The state's ideological framework was not just carved into the walls. It was embedded into the daily and annual cycle of an entire professional class whose lives depended on the monument's continued significance. The ritual calendar, with its festivals of renewal and days of offering, structured the year itself around the needs of the stone entity. This ongoing investment shaped how these empires were remembered and ultimately how they fell. A dynasty might end, an invading army might sack a city, but the physical shell of the monument often remained. Its continued presence, even in ruins, whispered of the forgotten contracts, the abandoned rituals, and the vast, intricate machine of belief and bureaucracy that once kept it alive. The silence of a derelict temple was the loudest testament to the end of the world it was built to sustain. The empire is gone, but the stones still speak. Long after the last priest departed and the final royal procession faded into memory, the monuments remained, silent giants in a changed world. Their creators had vanished, yet their greatest works embarked on a second, unexpected life, becoming not symbols of present power, but vessels for new stories, new fears, and new forms of authority. In medieval Europe, a traveler gazing upon the immense, broken oval of the Roman Colosseum had no concept of gladiatorial games. To them, this colossal shell was a temple to a forgotten sun god, or perhaps the ruined palace of a race of giants from a lost age. Its original purpose was erased, but its capacity to inspire awe and wonder was utterly undiminished. It commanded a different kind of respect, one born of mystery and the haunting beauty of decay. This transformation reveals a profound truth. When an empire collapses, its architecture does not simply become inert. It becomes a blank slate, and the next civilization in line will inevitably write its own meaning upon it. This process often began with the most practical of acts, the recycling of materials known as spoliation. For a new ruler, to build with the plundered stones of a fallen empire was a powerful political statement. It was a way to physically digest the past, to incorporate its perceived legitimacy and grandeur into a new order. Across the Mediterranean, Byzantine churches rose with columns taken directly from Roman forums and temples. A medieval fortress might be constructed from the precisely cut blocks of a pharaonic temple wall. This was not mere convenience. It was a symbolic cannibalism, a declaration that the new kingdom was the rightful heir to the old glory, literally building its future from the bones of the past. The stone carried the ghost of its first meaning, lending an aura of antiquity and permanence to the upstart regime. Scholars of heritage studies describe sites like these as palimpsests, a term from ancient manuscripts where old text is scraped away to make room for new writing, yet traces of the original often remain visible beneath. A monument is the ultimate palimpsest. Each generation that encounters it, whether to worship, to loot, or to wonder, adds a new layer of interpretation. The Maya city of Chichen Itza, abandoned to the jungle, was later resettled and reinterpreted by new peoples who added their own structures to the sacred site. Its meaning was not fixed, but continuously rewritten by the needs and beliefs of those who came after. This rewriting often took the form of myth. Without written records, later cultures looked upon the staggering achievements of their predecessors and crafted explanations that fit their own worldview. The massive, polygonal walls of Sacsayhuaman in Peru were so impeccably fitted that Inca legend said they were assembled by giants, or that the stones were softened by a magical plant and then set in place. The colossal statues on Easter Island, the Moai, were said by later islanders to have walked to their positions by supernatural means. These myths are not failures of understanding. They are testaments to the enduring power of the architecture itself. The structures were so extraordinary that they demanded a superhuman origin story, thus preserving their status as objects of power, even as their true history faded. This cycle of loss and reinterpretation reached a fever pitch in the age of colonial exploration. When European explorers stumbled upon the vine-choked temples of Angkor Wat or the imposing stone towers of Great Zimbabwe, they were confronted with a cognitive crisis. The scale and sophistication of these ruins did not fit their preconceived narratives about the cultures they encountered. The response was often to craft new myths of their own, attributing the buildings to lost white civilizations, to the Phoenicians, or to the Queen of Sheba. These colonial narratives served a specific power dynamic. By divorcing the monuments from the indigenous peoples living nearby, they could construct a story of civilizational rise and fall that justified colonial intervention as a kind of rescue mission, a reclaiming of a lost glory that the current inhabitants were deemed incapable of understanding or maintaining. In this way, the abandoned monument never truly retires from its role in the contest of knowledge and power. Its silent presence continues to provoke questions, to inspire legends, and to be weaponized for political ends centuries after its builders have turned to dust. It becomes a bridge across time, forcing every new era to confront the ambition of the old and to define itself in relation to that haunting legacy. The story does not end with the collapse of the last empire. It simply changes key, and the stones begin to sing a different but no less compelling song. A new kind of excavation began in the 19th century, one that unearthed not just stone but identity. As modern nation-states emerged, they faced a pressing question. How do you invent a shared past for a people who may never have seen themselves as one? The answer was waiting, buried just beneath the soil. The trowels and brushes of early archaeologists, often funded by imperial powers or ambitious new republics, did more than reveal lost cities. They became tools for writing a new kind of national scripture, with ancient monuments serving as the foundational chapters. This was the modern gaze, a powerful fusion of scholarship and politics that repurposed the architectural language of old empires to build the myths of new ones. A European explorer mapping the jungles of Cambodia, or a Mexican intellectual studying the ruins of Teotihuacan, was not a neutral observer. They were an editor, selecting which parts of a complex, multi-layered past would be celebrated and which would be quietly omitted to craft a seamless, heroic origin story. This process required a deliberate act of selective memory. The post-colonial scholar Partha Chatterjee has observed how nationalist projects often construct a golden age of ancient glory, followed by a period of darkness or foreign subjugation, culminating in a modern rebirth. The monumental ruin was the perfect, immutable proof of that initial golden age. In Iran, the Pahlavi dynasty in the 20th century heavily promoted the ruins of Persepolis, framing the Achaemenid Empire not as a vast, multicultural ancient power, but as the direct, glorious predecessor of the modern Iranian nation. This narrative conveniently bypassed centuries of other influences to draw a straight, legitimizing line from Cyrus the Great to the contemporary Shah. Similarly, following its revolution, Mexico actively incorporated Aztec imagery, like the eagle and cactus from the foundation myth of Tenochtitlan, into its state seals and public art, transforming symbols of a conquered empire into emblems of a resilient, indigenous-rooted national spirit. This reclamation was never just about pride. It was a strategic deployment of cultural capital. The newly interpreted monument was then placed within modern institutions designed to manage this knowledge. National museums arose as secular temples, where carefully arranged artifacts told the state-approved story of a people's journey. Tourism ministries marketed these sites as must-see destinations, turning awe into economic revenue. The ultimate modern stamp of approval came with UNESCO World Heritage designation, a global acknowledgement that a site was of outstanding universal value. This status, while aimed at preservation, also formally inscribed the monument into a world narrative, boosting its prestige and the cultural standing of the nation that hosted it. This modern repurposing reveals a profound continuity. The power to define what a monument means, who it belongs to, and what story it tells remains a potent form of authority. The stones themselves are constant, but the meanings we project onto them are as fluid as politics itself. The knowledge produced by archaeology, once seen as pure science, is now understood to be deeply intertwined with the questions we ask and the identities we seek. It forces us to look at our own gaze with humility. If empires built monuments to broadcast an unchanging truth, and modern nations dig them up to forge a unifying past, what narratives are we today crafting through our own interpretations? What complexities might we be smoothing over in our desire for a clean, impressive lineage? The ancient architects sought to control the present by building for eternity. We, their inheritors, seek to control the past by deciding what their eternity will say. A master mason runs his hand over a freshly cut granite block, his fingers reading the surface like a map. He shakes his head, points to a subtle irregularity, and demonstrates the correct angle with a single, practiced tap of his hammer. His knowledge is not written in any royal decree. It lives in the calluses on his hands and the silent understanding passed from father to son, from mentor to apprentice across generations. This man, whose name is lost to us, held the true keys to the empire's grandeur. While the pharaoh's name was carved in stone for eternity, the names of the architects, engineers, and artisans who translated his vision into reality were deliberately omitted. Their power was not in proclamation, but in indispensable skill, a form of authority so potent it had to remain unseen. These specialists operated within closed networks, often guilds or specific families who guarded their techniques as state secrets. The precise recipe for the mortar that binds Inca stones, the method for achieving a mirror finish on Egyptian obelisk, the mathematical ratio for a perfectly stable arch, these were not public knowledge. They were proprietary technologies, a form of intellectual capital that gave these anonymous masters a unique kind of leverage. They could not claim the throne, but the throne could not be built without them. Their existence reveals a hidden economy of knowledge, one where practical genius created a quiet, professional aristocracy based on merit. This tension is central to understanding these projects. The final monument shouts a story of singular, divine kingship, yet it was born from a cacophony of collective, specialized human effort. The narrative etched on the walls is one of unity under one ruler, but the process of building exposed a complex society of distinct roles, hierarchies, and secretive expertise. Feminist archaeology has sharpened our focus on the most systematically overlooked contributors of all, the women whose labor formed the essential backdrop to every stone laid. While they are rarely depicted in the ceremonial reliefs of construction, evidence from worker settlements tells a different story. At sites like Deir el-Medina in Egypt, where the builders of the royal tombs lived, we find records and artifacts that speak of a vibrant community. Women here were not passive. They were the weavers producing the textiles for clothing and sails, the potters creating the vessels that carried food and water to the site, the bakers feeding thousands. Some held administrative roles, managing household economies that supported the absent laborers. Their work provided the literal and social fabric that sustained the monumental project. Without this foundational, sustaining labor, the entire enterprise would have ground to a halt. The pyramid, in its silent majesty, is also a testament to the meals prepared, the clothes mended, and the communities maintained in its shadow. Recognizing this unseen labor does not diminish the achievement. It deepens it immeasurably. It shifts our understanding from a story of autocratic command to one of intricate social collaboration. The knowledge required to build an empire was not concentrated in a single royal mind, but distributed across a vast network of individuals, each holding a crucial piece of the puzzle. The farmer knew the soil, the sailor knew the currents, the mason knew the grain of the stone, and the weaver knew the strength of the thread. The monumental structure was the point where all these streams of knowledge converged and were made permanent. To see only the king in the monument is to hear only one instrument in a vast symphony. This correction of our historical lens adds a crucial human layer to the stone edifice of history. It prompts a humbling reflection. For every name we remember, carved in a cartouche or recorded in an archive, how many thousands of names and lives and stories are forever silent? Our understanding of the past is built upon the visible record they left behind, but it is shadowed by the profound and permanent quiet of those they chose not to record. The granite walls of a pharaoh's tomb stand unyielding after 3,000 years. but the papyrus scroll that listed the names of every laborer who built it has long since crumbled to dust. This is the great, silent bias of history. For all their permanence, stone monuments preserve only the most carefully curated fraction of an empire's total knowledge. The true intellectual lifeblood of these civilizations flowed through far more fragile vessels: administrative records on wooden slips, poetry on bark, legal codes on parchment, and the living memory of oral tradition. What survives for us to study is not the full picture, but a monumental fragment, a breathtaking tip of a vast, sunken iceberg. The historian and classicist James O'Donnell frames this challenge elegantly, noting that for every permanent inscription carved in stone, there were thousands of perishable records that managed the day-to-day reality of the empire. This is the problem of ephemeral knowledge, the lost corpus that has vanished almost completely, leaving the silent architecture to speak for an entire world. Visualize the great library of Alexandria not as a marble hall, but as a warehouse stacked with thousands of papyrus scrolls, each one a census record, a shipping manifest, a philosophical debate, or a medical treatise. Now imagine that repository consumed not by a single legendary fire, but by the slow, inevitable feast of moisture, insects, and time. This is the fate that befell the overwhelming majority of recorded thought. The monuments that survived were designed to do exactly that, to endure, but they were never meant to hold the full record. They were the empire's press release, carved in granite for eternity, while the working documents, the drafts, the internal memos, and the personal letters were written on materials destined to return to the earth. This creates a profound distortion in our understanding. We see the perfect, idealized king smiting his enemies on a temple wall, but we do not have the fragile papyrus that recorded the tense council meeting where that military campaign was debated and nearly voted down. We see the flawless geometry of a pyramid inferring advanced mathematical texts, but we cannot read the apprentice's notes on the failed experiment with a new quarrying technique. From the silent stones, we can make some powerful inferences about the lost knowledge. The sheer precision of construction implies the existence of detailed architectural plans and complex calculation manuals. The consistency of artistic styles across vast distances suggests pattern books and training regimens for artisans. The logistical triumph of feeding a city of builders points to meticulous census data and agricultural yield reports. The monument itself is the final answer, but the mountains of working paperwork that produced that answer are gone. What the stones cannot tell us, however, is often more revealing. They cannot convey the sound of a marketplace argument, the scent of a particular incense used in a forgotten ritual, the taste of a commoner's meal, or the texture of a ballad sung at a harvest festival. They tell us nothing of dissent, of failed policies, of popular jokes at the ruler's expense, or of the private hopes of the people who lived in their shadow. The architecture presents a finished, official truth, airbrushed of all ambiguity and human frailty. This acknowledgement is not a defeat for archaeology, but a necessary humility. It reminds us that the grand narrative we piece together from ruins is built upon a foundation of profound silence. The ethical dimension of our fascination emerges here. When we look upon a pyramid, we are right to be awed by its scale and precision. But we must also remember that we are looking at a filtered image, a propaganda piece that has outlasted its own context. Our interpretation is an act of translation across a chasm of loss. It asks us to hold two truths in balance, to marvel at the enduring symbol while actively listening for the echoes of everything it was designed to omit. The stone endures, but it is the ghost of the ephemeral, the lost conversation, the burned scroll, and the forgotten song that truly haunts the space between the blocks. This leads us to a pivotal question. If our understanding of these empires is so inherently partial, shaped by what they chose to make permanent, how can we ever hope to hear the other side of the story? The silhouette of a pyramid has simply been rotated 90 degrees and clad in glass. The Burj Khalifa does not house a pharaoh's tomb, but its impossible height serves a strikingly similar purpose. It is a declaration of technological and economic supremacy, a man-made mountain that redefines the skyline of a modern city-state, announcing its arrival on the world stage with silent, overwhelming force. This monumental impulse never vanished. It simply traded limestone for steel and concrete, shifting its devotion from divine kings to new deities of capital, state ideology, and national prestige. The grammar remains hauntingly familiar: scale, exclusivity, and an unambiguous statement of control. Where an ancient ziggurat stored grain and ritual knowledge, a modern data center server farm stores the world's information, its bland, windowless architecture designed for security and efficiency, a fortress for the new currency of knowledge. The Three Gorges Dam in China does not align with a star, but it aligns with a national vision, taming a mighty river to demonstrate a breathtaking command over nature, providing energy and asserting a geopolitical presence on a continental scale. These are our pyramids and our great walls, built not with corvée labor but with global finance and advanced engineering, yet they spring from the same deep human well, the drive to reshape the world as a testament to what we know and who we are in charge. Sociologists who study these projects note a direct lineage. The corporate headquarters that dominates a city's financial district functions as a territorial marker, much like a royal palace complex. Its imposing design and exclusive materials, marble atriums and panoramic executive suites, create a hierarchy of access, separating the decision-makers from the managed. Its height is a form of brand dominance, a permanent advertisement in the sky that says we are here, we are successful, and our influence reaches upward. This is the architecture of the corporate empire, where balance sheets and market share are the sacred texts, and the building itself is the most reliable prophet of stability and growth. Similarly, a nation's investment in a space program, with its monumental rockets and sprawling launch complexes, is the ultimate modern monument. It projects power beyond Earth's atmosphere, demonstrating a fusion of scientific knowledge, industrial capacity, and political will that few can match. It is less about practical utility and more about the statement, a civilization announcing its capability to operate on a cosmic stage. The social dynamics surrounding these modern projects echo ancient patterns. The construction of a massive dam or a new capital city still involves the large-scale mobilization of resources and labor, often requiring the relocation of communities and the reshaping of local ecologies. The knowledge required to execute these plans is highly specialized, held by elite cadres of engineers, architects, and planners, creating a new priestly class of technical experts whose expertise legitimizes the vision of the political or corporate leadership. The legacy sought is the same, to be remembered for having changed the face of the world. Yet there is a crucial distinction in service. Where a pyramid served a god-king's journey to eternity, a skyscraper serves shareholder value and urban density. Where a Roman aqueduct served public health and civic pride, a modern surveillance network, integrated into a city's very infrastructure, serves state security and data collection. The underlying grammar is repurposed. The control is less about mediating with the cosmos and more about optimizing flow, whether of capital, information, or human behavior. This reflection makes the ancient stones suddenly feel less distant. Studying why Ramses II carved his image onto a cliff face at Abu Simbel helps us understand why a corporation brands its logo on a global fleet of satellites. The tools have changed, but the conversation between architecture, knowledge, and power is one humanity has never stopped having. We are still building our answers to those eternal questions. Who are we? What can we do, and how will we be remembered? Our modern landscapes are simply the latest dialect in that enduring, monumental language. The final stage of this journey does not happen in a distant desert or a forgotten jungle, but within our own minds. We stand before the weathered columns of the Parthenon or gaze at a photograph of the Great Wall, and the most important question is no longer what we see, but how we choose to see it. This is the shift from passive awe to active interpretation, a move from simply consuming a monument's beauty to critically reading its stone text. Every ancient structure is a political document frozen in time, and we hold the key to deciphering its layered message. To begin this practice, we can apply a simple, powerful framework of questions to any site. First, follow the money and the access who funded this project. Was it a single ruler's treasury, a priestly class, or communal tribute? Then, map the boundaries: who was permitted to enter its inner sanctum, and who was restricted to the outer courtyards or barred entirely. The architecture of access is a direct diagram of social power. Next, interrogate the materials. That marble, that cedar, that gold, where did it come from? Its journey tells a hidden story of trade networks, conquered territories, and extracted wealth. Look up and around. What does the alignment emphasize? A mountain, a star, a river. This reveals what cosmic or natural force the builders sought to harness for legitimacy. Finally, and most importantly, ask about the invisible hands. What system of labor, paid or compelled, summoned this form from the earth? The answers to these questions begin to peel back the polished surface of history. Scholars in critical heritage studies remind us that there is no single, correct interpretation of these places. Instead, they are palimpsests, bearing the original intent of the builders, the reinterpretations of later cultures who reused or feared them, and now our own modern perspectives and biases. Our gaze is not neutral. When a 19th century European explorer saw the ruins of Great Zimbabwe, he saw a mystery to be solved by outsiders. When a post-colonial nation looks at the same stones, they see a foundation for national identity. Both are readings, each shaped by its own time and purpose. This critical lens transforms our relationship with history from one of consumption to one of dialogue. Visiting an ancient site becomes a conversation across millennia. We are not just learning what happened, we are engaging with why it was presented this way and what alternative stories were left uncarved. It allows us to see the echoes of these ancient power plays in our own world, in the towering skyscrapers of financial districts, in the vast server farms that hold our data, in the monumental projects that reshape landscapes for political vision. The language of power has evolved, but its grammar of scale, exclusion, and spectacle remains deeply familiar. By learning to read the stones critically, we do more than understand the past. We become more literate interpreters of the present, able to see the monumental statements being built around us today and to ask quietly who this serves, what it costs, and what story it is trying to tell before the weathering of time even begins. The pyramid, the ziggurat, the Great Wall, they were never just one thing. They were the ancient world's original multi-tools, a breathtaking fusion of separate strands of human understanding hammered into a single, unbreakable form. This was the ultimate synthesis. To see these structures clearly, we must stop separating their purposes. They were not a temple and a bank and a calendar. They were a temple-bank calendar, an indivisible unit where every function reinforced every other. The knowledge required to create them was equally unified. An architect was not just an engineer, he was an astronomer reading the stars to set the foundation, a psychologist calculating the awe a shadow would inspire, a logistician organizing the feeding of thousands, and a theologian encoding divine law into geometric ratios. His blueprint was a master plan that collapsed a dozen disciplines into one actionable vision. The empire, in turn, was the only entity capable of gathering all these disparate strands of knowledge, concentrating them under a single will, and paying the immense cost to weave them together. The resulting structure then performed a symphony of functions simultaneously. It was a bank, but not of money. It was a bank of knowledge, storing agricultural cycles in its alignment, mathematical principles in its proportions, and theological dogma in its carvings. It was an economic engine, circulating grain and labor through its construction and maintenance, turning tax surplus into civic employment and ideological spectacle. It was a theater of ritual where controlled sound, light, and movement manufactured experiences of the sacred, making abstract beliefs visceral and unforgettable. Most brilliantly, it was a three-dimensional diagram of the society that built it. Its inaccessibility mirrored social hierarchy. Its required upkeep created permanent, state-funded jobs. Its very existence on the landscape was a daily, silent lesson in where everyone belonged. This created the powerful feedback loop that defined imperial ascent. Power, initially seized by force or inherited by tradition, enabled the concentration of specialized knowledge. That concentrated knowledge was then deployed to build a monument of staggering ambition. The finished monument, in turn, legitimized and expanded the very power that initiated the project. It made authority feel inevitable, a natural law as solid as the stones themselves. This loop is why architecture became empire's most resilient ambassador. Treaties can be burned, dynasties can fall, but a mountain of carved granite continues to speak long after the voices of its creators have faded. It projects identity not just across space, dominating the view for miles, but across time, speaking to future generations in a language of sheer presence. To understand this synthesis is to hold a master key. It unlocks the true purpose behind the placement of every stone, the choice of every material, the precision of every alignment. It reveals that these civilizations were not merely building shelters or tombs. They were building arguments, constructing their own legitimacy from the ground up, using every tool of knowledge they possessed. This ancient impulse to synthesize, to turn collective understanding into a permanent statement of who we are and what we can do, never truly left us. It simply found new materials and new stories to tell. That language is still being spoken today. From the ziggurats reaching for the gods to the pyramids anchoring the pharaohs in eternity, we have traced a conversation carved in stone. These monuments were never silent. They spoke a complex, deliberate dialect of control, wisdom, and ambition, a language that actively shaped the civilizations that built them. We have seen how they defined knowledge by encoding it into their very fabric, locking calendars in alignments and state secrets in inaccessible chambers. We have witnessed how they defined power by making it visible, tangible, and seemingly as permanent as the horizon, transforming abstract authority into an undeniable fact of the landscape. The key takeaway is profound. Monumental architecture was the ultimate political technology of the ancient world. It was a physical algorithm, a stone-coded program that processed raw resources, human labor, and collective belief into a single output, lasting authority. It was the original fusion of hardware and ideology. As you look at the world around you now, at the modern towers that pierce clouds and the dams that tame rivers, remember this deep history. Consider what forms of knowledge our own monuments are built upon. Are they temples to data, to capital, to national vision? And ask what kind of power they make tangible and eternal in our own age. The grammar may have changed, but the conversation between building, knowing, and ruling continues. If this exploration has reshaped how you see the ancient world, if you now look at a ruin and hear its forgotten arguments, share your thoughts in the comments below. For more journeys into the hidden narratives of history, subscribe and join us as we continue to decode the past. Thank you for watching, and remember, every great structure has a story. And every story holds a lesson about the enduring human desire to build, to know, and to leave a mark that whispers to the future.